I wrote a book about John Brown and Abraham Lincoln because I wanted to answer a basic question of American history. But the question actually is bigger than American history. It's a question of, well, life in a civilized society. And the question is this: what does a good person do in the face of evil? What do you do when you see bad things going on around you? It's a question that emerges from time to time. Probably every generation has to deal with it. I'm a little bit too young to have marched in the civil rights demonstrations, protests, marches of the 1960s, but I was old enough, I was in college, toward the tail end of the Vietnam War. And I participated in protests against the Vietnam War. I thought it was a misguided war. I thought it was downright wrong. And so I, marched. I don't think I carried any signs, but I marched and shouted and did that sort of thing. I also filed for and became a conscientious objector to the war, but my simply opting out of the war didn't really end the war any sooner. I knew people who were willing to engage in violent protest. I didn't know anybody who was willing to set off a bomb to blow up something. I didn't know anybody who was willing to risk harm to individual lives. I did know people who were willing to throw a brick through a window, or maybe to start a fire under a police car or something like that. And I had to ask myself, is that right? I talked to them about it, and they said, well, look, if breaking a window that costs $400 to fix is going to get us closer to the end of a war that is costing 400 lives every week or something like that, well, it's a small price to pay. And I thought about it, and I didn't come to exactly the same conclusion for myself, but at least I understood where this decision was coming from. So anyway, these are questions that come up in recent months in the United States in the last year. People have had to decide how to respond to the Black Lives Matter protests, to take part in them, to march, to sign things, to perhaps engage in violent protest, and in protests against inequality of various other sorts, police brutality, the whole thing. So these are questions that come up all the time. On the other side, there are people, evidently, who believe that the presidential election was stolen by the Democrats, and who were prepared to break laws and perhaps, and indeed, to inflict violence in hopes of overturning that decision. So anyway, these are questions that come up all the time in a democracy. I guess they don't come up so much if you live under a monarch or under a dictator where individuals, they don't take part in the making of policy. But if you're involved in the making of policy, in a democracy, even your vote, at the very least, is part of the decision-making process. These are questions you have to deal with. So it's a question that has intrigued me for a long time. And I decided to take it up in the context of the issue of slavery. And I wanted to identify and examine two people who agreed that slavery was wrong, but disagreed on what to do about it. And so I chose John Brown and Abraham Lincoln. But in telling their story, I had to examine the question of, well, who exactly, how many people, indeed in the United States, thought slavery was wrong? And the reason that this is of interest to me, and is of historical interest, of course, but I teach American history to 18 and 19-year-olds, up to graduate students too, but my big introductory class is mostly 18 and 19-year-olds. And they have a very difficult time understanding a period in American history where not everybody agreed wholeheartedly that slavery was wrong. Now, needless to say, if you live in a democracy or even a functioning republic, and everybody agrees that something is wrong, well, that something doesn't persist very long. Because as a democracy, you get to change the policies. So the fact that slavery persisted in the United States until the 1860s indicated that there was a substantial portion of the American population who thought that it was at least okay maybe even in the context of it was a necessary evil. And so I have to try to take my students back to a time when people would see that. And in fact, one of the things I point out that when John Brown was born in 1800, a lot of people in the country, not just in the South, but in the North as well, thought that slavery, North by 1800, let's go back to 1776. We'll start there with the Declaration of Independence. At that time, slavery was legal in every state, new states of the Union, and most people didn't think it was a particularly big deal. If they thought about it at all, they thought, okay, it is not a good thing. It's one of those evils of life that you can't get away from. Benjamin Franklin identified death and taxes. They don't perhaps rise to the same, well, they're not quite in the same category. You can't avoid death. Presumably you can lower the tax if you want to. But there are lots of things in life at any time that people get kind of uncomfortable about. When I ask my students these days to imagine, so what are we doing? What are they doing? That their grandchildren will come to look on with disbelief. How could you do such a thing? And one issue that comes up, the one that often comes up is a question of global warming, climate change. And they imagine that their grandchildren will say, boy, you saw this coming, and why didn't you do more about it? Maybe. Another possibility is animal rights. And at the moment, animals don't have much in the way of rights in American courts or in the courts of most countries, but it's not out of the question that one day they will. And if they do, and maybe this will come along with, I don't think it'll kind of happen if there's because there's universal conversion to veganism. I think it's more likely that scientists will figure out how to grow meat in a lab, and so you can have a hamburger without having to kill a cow. And when that happens, then it will certainly be easier to say animals have rights. And then in that distant time, I don't know, 50 years from now, 40, maybe less, people look back on us and say, how could you tear apart dead animals with your teeth? And so anyway, in 1776, most Americans thought that slavery fell in the category of necessary evils. It's evil. I wouldn't want to be a slave myself. But on the other hand, we can't figure out how to run the economy without it. Whether it's the economy of Virginia, and in the 18th century, still growing tobacco, the economy of Connecticut. Connecticut had a large tobacco industry. And a few places were starting to shift to cotton. But the thing was, this is the way the world works. And in terms of the morality of slavery, well, slavery was inherited from generations and millennia past. And there'd always been slavery, so that's the way it is. It's kind of like we've always eaten meat, or we've always conducted war. No, war is another issue where people might say, if we figure out how to get along without war, people say, how could you do such a thing? How could you slaughter 40, 60 million people in World War II? What a horrible civilization you existed in. Anyway, so part of my story is the evolution of ideas on the morality of slavery. And John Brown and Abraham Lincoln are two cases in point. So John Brown was born in Connecticut. He grew up, however, in Ohio. And in Ohio, in the early 19th century, slavery was not legal. It never had been legal in Ohio, but it was legal across the Ohio River in Kentucky. And people who had slaves in Kentucky would bring their enslaved workers into Ohio. Sometimes they'd bring them for a while. If they were driving a herd of cattle or something in, they'd bring the slaves in, and nobody really thought much of it. John Brown grew up seeing white people working in fields and black people working in fields. And he saw white people doing manual labor and black people doing manual labor. And he didn't really think much about the difference between the two. He was too young to sort of understand concepts of ownership. But there was a day when he was maybe 8 or 9 years old. And he remembered this in later years when he became somewhat notorious and people wanted to know about the origin and evolution of his views on slavery. And John Brown described a moment when he was playing with this other kid. And this other kid happened to be a black boy. And the two were playing as boys do. And John Brown didn't think much of it one way or the other. Until, after they'd been playing a while, this man, a white man, came up and started yelling at the black boy, and then started beating him around the head and shoulders. And John Brown was mystified by this at first. He recalled. He said, yeah, I'm really puzzled. What's going on? And then it was explained to him what the relationship was between this guy who was the kid's owner and the kid himself. And then it hit home to John Brown that, well, wait, this kid, my playmate, is in a different situation than I am. Nobody gets to beat me around the head like that. His father probably could legally, but his father didn't. But, and so John Brown recognized in a kind of a personal way, I'm here and this boy is here, and I'm in a different world because he's a slave and I'm not. So it began to nag at John Brown. And he began to ask himself what he could do to deal with this. And basically, he has concluded that slavery is wrong. But that's only a first step. The question is, what do you, John Brown, do about it? Now, John Brown, 9 years old. 9-year-old kids don't do much of anything along those lines. But as he got older, he began thinking about it. He began wrestling with this problem more and more. And the community he lived in Ohio, there were a growing number of people who were opposed to slavery. It's really only by the time John Brown gets to be about 30 or so that what you would call an abolitionist movement develops in the United States. And he happened to live in a town of Hudson, Ohio, where there were a lot of abolitionists by the mid-1830s. But John Brown remembered, and people remembered about John Brown, that there was a moment when a realization came to him. He had this epiphany. And it occurred in 1837. Elijah Lovejoy, an abolitionist editor, had just been murdered by a mob. And John Brown thought, this is where the road forks. Because until this time, John Brown had been a fairly moderate, fairly mild-mannered opponent of slavery. But he wouldn't have called himself a full-blown abolitionist in the sense that slavery is so evil it must end right now. But the murder of Elijah Lovejoy caused John Brown to stand up in his church in Hudson, Ohio, and declare to the congregation, declare before the eyes of God, that he was going to devote the rest of his life to the fight against slavery, against this evil thing. So this is John Brown. Now, it's probably significant for John Brown's story, maybe not so significant for the broader question of what does the good person do in the face of evil. But it's probably significant for John Brown's story that John Brown never really was a success at much of anything. He was a good-hearted person. He was able and willing to work hard. But the pieces of life just didn't fit together very well, with one important exception. John Brown was really good at having children. He had 20 kids by 2 wives. The first one died. But other than that, John Brown had to figure out how to support this family, and he just wasn't very good at it. He tried his hand at farming, and that didn't go well. And he tried his hand at various kinds of business. He had a cattle business. He was this kind of business, that kind of business. He raised sheep. He just did one thing and another, and it just didn't work. Now, I'm sure that somebody else in John Brown's circumstances could have made it work, but he didn't have that sort of methodical approach to life. I guess he didn't have the desire, the ambition to make something of himself, at least not in that way. And so this is John Brown. He got involved in the anti-slavery movement. He assisted with the Underground Railroad, helping escaped slaves to make their way to freedom in Canada. But he still just couldn't quite figure out how to make things work. He moved his family. This is no small thing. He moved his family to what amounted to an African-American colony in upstate New York. It had been funded by some abolitionist philanthropists. And the idea was to give land and give tools and opportunity to free African-Americans so that they could demonstrate, first of all, they could improve their lives themselves, but so they could demonstrate that they were just as competent in the world. They could become as successful as white people, because By the 1840s, it was fairly common for slave owners and their apologists in the South, and by this time it's entirely in the South, to say that slaves just aren't fit. They can't tend to themselves. They need the patriarchal hand of slave masters and so on. And so this colony at North Elba in upstate New York was designed to give the lie to this. And John Brown participated in this. And he was well liked by his neighbors. He was respected by his neighbors. And it was striking to even the neighbors there, even in the abolitionist community, to treat black people with sort of full respect and equality. That was unusual. There were a lot of abolitionists who looked upon slaves, black people, as kind of their personal project, but not somebody that they would ever live next door to. But John Brown seemed to have that very colorblind, egalitarian streak in his personality, and so people respected him for this. But still, he hadn't found his mission in life, and that's going to come in a moment. So we'll get back to that. So my other character is Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln grew up around slavery as well. He was born in Kentucky, and he spent much of his childhood and young manhood in Indiana. And Kentucky, a slave state, and Indiana and then Illinois, these are border states, and states that border the slave territory. And so he was fully aware of what the existence of slavery was. One of the reasons the family, Lincoln's father, moved the family out of Kentucky was that he didn't want to have to compete himself with unpaid slave labor, and presumably he didn't want his son to have to do it either. Which raises an interesting kind of ambivalence on the part of various people among whites regarding slavery, because there was a certain strain of thought among white workers, we'll call them sort of working class people, manual laborers, that, okay, we don't like to be around slaves, we don't like slavery, because it tends to depress the wage scale, because slaves get paid just a minimal subsistence wage in effect, and we don't want our wages driven down to that subsistence level. But on the other hand, white workers were not universally enthusiastic about freeing slaves, because then all of a sudden these slave labor, they're going to become free labor and compete directly with them. As long as they were slaves, they competed sort of indirectly. White workers often did different things than slave workers did. But if they became free workers, then they could actually compete for the jobs that the white workers had. So there was an ambivalence in this. And so Lincoln's family, Lincoln himself, was kind of part of this ambivalent thing. They didn't like slavery, but it was for a variety of reasons, not entirely moral. With Lincoln, the moral epiphany comes when he is living in Indiana and he hires out to take a flatboat of cargo to New Orleans, float it down the Ohio River and then down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. And the standard practice, somebody had a cargo they wanted to sell, they would build a flatboat and they would hire somebody like Lincoln, I think he was 19 years old or something like this, and off he'd go down the river. And when he got to New Orleans, and flatboats aren't really hard to manage, when he got to New Orleans, he would sell the cargo, and he would break up the flatboat, sell it for lumber, and then he'd find his way back home. Lincoln went to New Orleans, and for the first time in his life, he saw the operation of the slave system. No longer was he just seeing slaves out in the field. Now he was seeing enslaved peoples put on the auction block and sold just the way horses or cattle would be sold. And for Lincoln, this really encapsulated the degradation that slavery inflicted upon those who were caught in its grasp. And it really gave the lie in Lincoln's mind to what the United States was supposed to be about. Again, as with John Brown, when you saw enslaved workers and free workers just working kind of side by side, and they go home and you don't really notice that much different. But Lincoln knew perfectly well that there was no place in the United States where white people were put on the auction block and were, bang, off you go. So slavery had that very degrading, demeaning quality. And Lincoln thought, okay, this crosses my line. And this is crucial when I get back to this basic question. So what does the good person do in the face of evil? There comes a point when that person, whoever that person is, you, me, anybody else, where some line is crossed and you decide, I gotta take action, I have to do something. Okay, so we've got John Brown and Abraham Lincoln to the point in their lives, respectively, where they decide they have to do something. But what is that something? That's the question. This is my fundamental question. So I had to choose two people who agreed, in my case, that slavery was wrong. Because if I had somebody who thought, okay, slavery is wrong, and somebody else who thinks that slavery is okay, John Calhoun, let's say, on this side. Well, John Calhoun would say we don't have to do anything about slavery because it's fine. No, for my question, what do you do in the face of evil? I got to have an experiment where two people agree on the evil, but then they differ on what to do about it. So, John Brown, Abraham Lincoln think that slavery is evil. But that's the easy question. It's the easy part. We conclude that it's wrong. The hard part is, what do you do about it? John Brown decided that slavery was so evil, and I have to say that because John Brown was not involved in politics, was not a lawyer, was not particularly well educated, John Brown, for example, would not have thought of running for office on an anti-slavery platform or anything like that. This was just beyond his imagination, beyond his capabilities. So he decided that he would take direct action, but he still didn't know quite what that direct action was until, for both men, Brown and Lincoln, there's a trigger that sets them on the path that they're going to wind up traveling, and that is the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 overturned a key aspect of the settlement that was known as the Missouri Compromise of 1820. That said, at least in this part, that said that the territory, the northern part of the old Louisiana Purchase, which at the time was half of the United States, the northern part of that will be forever off limits to slavery. The southern part can be slave in due course, but the northern part is always going to be off limits to slavery. And at the time, there was still this belief among many people that if slavery could simply be contained, then it would eventually die of its own weight. And there was a logic to this, and this logic goes all the way back to George Washington in the 18th century. By the 1790s, George Washington had concluded that plantation agriculture, as it had been handed down to him, was not going concern for very long. That tobacco in particular, tobacco was the big cash crop and had been since the early 1600s, so for almost 2 centuries. But it had worn out the soil. And so Washington got out of the business of being what you would call really a planter. And he shifted into growing wheat and crops that were grown in the north. Now this is actually very important because crops like wheat are crops that don't require, in fact don't even favor, an enslaved workforce. Because an enslaved workforce is by its nature a very unflexible workforce. With wheat, you just plant the way you plow, you plant, you walk away and you come back 4 or 5 months later and you harvest it. But meantime, there's not much for the workers to do. So what you want if you're growing wheat is a workforce that you can hire for 3 weeks here and then tell them to go away and then come back 4 months later and we'll hire you for 2 weeks and there you go. Tobacco, by contrast, is a crop that requires tending sort of almost year-round. So this was where Washington thought things were going. Now, in fact, they didn't quite go that way because of the introduction of cotton and the invention of the cotton gin that made the processing of cotton more efficient and therefore more profitable. But anyway, George Washington realized that plantation, oh, by the way, I should say that cotton never became as big a deal in Virginia as it would, say, in Mississippi and Alabama and Texas and Arkansas. And it was for this reason that by the 1840s and 1850s, especially by the 1850s, slavery was unprofitable in Virginia simply as a means of growing crops. What made slavery still profitable in Virginia and some of those older states was the market for new slaves in places like Texas and Arkansas and Mississippi and Louisiana. So for Eastern slave owners, there was this strong incentive, almost an imperative, to expand. We have to expand slavery in order to make it profitable for us. Anyway, so what the Kansas-Nebraska Act does is overturn this idea that slavery will be contained. No, now slavery is going to expand. So this causes John Brown to take up arms. John Brown takes up arms against slavery in the phenomenon known as Bleeding Kansas. And he goes to Kansas with his adult sons. And he takes part in what amounts to the guerrilla war going on there. And John Brown leads a small band, including a couple of his sons, on what amounted to a murder mission. John Brown and this small group of men, they drag 5 pro-slavery settlers out of their homes in the dark of night and brutally murder them, hack them to death with broadswords, as a message to other pro-slavery settlers who might be coming to Kansas in the hopes of making Kansas a state, Kansas now a territory, make Kansas a slave state when the time comes. So John Brown he's really crossed a line. He's gone to the point where his convictions about the evil of slavery have made him believe that essentially anything is justified in the battle against slavery. John Brown would go on from there to launch a raid on Harper's Ferry, which would make him nationally known, world known. The raid failed. The point of the raid, however, was to arm slaves who would rise up against their masters and would fight violently for their freedom. John Brown was willing to kill people, and he was willing to start a war, which would lead to the deaths of many other people, because he thought that slavery was so wrong, so evil. And this is John Brown's answer to the question, what does the good man do against the evil of slavery? That's John Brown. Abraham Lincoln is energized by the same Kansas-Nebraska Act. Lincoln had been in politics before, but he got back into the lawyering business. But the Kansas-Nebraska Act brought him back into politics because he thought, oh my gosh, now that that barrier against the expansion of slavery has gone away, then good people, anti-slavery people, need to take strong action. But for Lincoln, the violent action that John Brown was willing to take was not only wrong in its own right, but it was counterproductive. What Lincoln believed, Lincoln followed Henry Clay, what Lincoln called his beau ideal of the statesman, his hero, his model of how a politician should act. Henry Clay had believed, and Lincoln believed after him, that slavery would be ended when Southerners came to the same conclusion that Northerners had come to in the previous decades, that slavery no longer suited them, that it was either no longer profitable or that it was not profitable enough to overcome the moral qualms they had about it. Lincoln concluded that in contrast to Brown's violent action against slavery, the solution was a patient but firm approach through politics. Lincoln was a constitutionalist. Lincoln revered the Constitution. Many abolitionists, Lincoln was not an abolitionist. Many abolitionists despised the Constitution. They scorned the Constitution. They said basically it's what guarantees slavery. But Lincoln believed that the Constitution was what guaranteed America's freedom, the freedoms of all Americans. Lose the Constitution and the freedoms of all Americans are going to be at risk. This was Lincoln's conclusion. So Lincoln insisted on charting a political path. And Lincoln understood that slavery would not end in the United States until the Constitution was amended. The Constitution, in Lincoln's interpretation, that of nearly everybody else, guaranteed the existence of slavery in the states where it existed. And the only way to end slavery was as it had been ended in the North, state by state, or conceivably you could amend the Constitution, but that would be almost as hard. But that's the way it would have to happen. This was Lincoln's view. So Lincoln charted this moderate path, and it got him eventually the nomination of the Republican Party. It got him elected president, at which point it began to appear that his moderate path was not going to happen. Because in response to his election, of course, the South, 11 ultimately Southern states secede, and Lincoln then is faced with a war to bring or hold the Union together. And in the consequence of this, emancipation sort of pops out. It's a side effect of Lincoln's attempt to hold the Union together. So there's an irony here in that John Brown tried to start a war to free the slaves, and he failed. His war didn't get going, and it didn't free any slaves. Lincoln tried to avoid a war, believing that it was important to honor the Constitution and to do this peacefully. He didn't avoid the war, and the war is what wound up being the engine of emancipation. So that's my story. I believe we're going to have a chance to talk about this when we have our conversation, so we'll have more to say about it then.